All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 5th, 1991, in the Washington, D.C. suburb of Arlington, Virginia, a group of activists arrive at the home of North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms. Using ladders, several of them climbed up on the roof of the house, and from there they unfurled a giant piece of fabric, which was then inflated by their comrades on the front lawn. And soon the senator's house was surrounded by a giant yellow condom, reading, "A condom to stop unsafe politics. Helms is deadlier than a virus." This stunt, this act of protest, was led by members of ACT UP, a group that worked to raise AIDS awareness and fight to end the epidemic. And in this particular moment was protesting Helms because he was one of the most vocal opponents of funding AIDS research, in addition to being one of the most anti-gay members of Congress. So, here to discuss ACT UP versus Jesse Helms and what you do when you wake up in the morning and there is a giant condom over the roof of your house.
Common experience we've all had.
Exactly. As always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So listeners, permission to pause this podcast and go Google Jesse Helms giant condom house. Hit the image search button and you will see what we're talking about here. But I will also say, let's spend a little time describing exactly what this looks like. Let's little theater of the mind here, but it is quite the remarkable visual spectacle. So it's this yellow thing over the roof of Jesse Helms' house. You can't even see the home, but you assume that there's a home under there. It's in a leafy suburb. I don't know. Feel free to jump in at any point here. There is a.
It looks like a mushroom.
There's a mushroom tip. Okay, thank you for saying it. There's
a little tip on the top of it.
Yeah. It looks like a condom, but
or maybe a cupcake.
Yeah.
Wow.
It is,
way to ruin cupcakes, Kellie.
Yeah, seriously. Look, Look, let's just embrace the language here. It is a two-story house, which means that it's relatively squat. So there is not much shaft in this picture. It is all tip, and so one could maybe think it's an acorn. Maybe it has sort of looks a little bit like maybe it's an acorn sitting on top of a little.
I'd buy that
cupcake or something. But then
an acorn mushroom mashup, I think, is what we're describing.
Yes, hopefully just.
Oh,
so now that we've planted that picture in people's heads, they can go Google and see how much those match up. But nevertheless, a remarkable stunt, full coverage, like any good condom, like really sealed in nicely. And as we said, like a real act of protest around a serious issue here, and these big bold block letters that say "A condom to stop unsafe politics. Helms is deadlier than a virus." So the message, even if the visual isn't immediately one-to-one, the message is very clear.
Can I just say it takes balls to do this?
Well, there you go. It certainly does. Yes. And so actually, and I guess maybe let's start with ACT UP, right? I mean, we've mentioned them briefly on the show before, but, this is very much within the ACT UP ethos are these kinds of stunts, political theater, aggressive tactics.
Yeah. ACT UP was known for doing these very extravagant, dramatic, explicit demonstrations, but they were so effective in drawing in public attention and getting people to take note, to pause, and to look at what was going on. And the serious aspect of this is that people were dying of AIDS at, crazy rates. And there was basically a standoff politically about how to go about getting people help, how to expedite getting them help as quickly as possible. And so ACT UP really takes this, stance to get as many people to pay attention to their issue as possible, and to really target people that were the major opponents of this. And so Jesse Helms really becomes the probably greatest opponent to AIDS activism and LGBTQ issues of the day.
And if we could just kind of paint a picture of what this looks like, because today there is bipartisan support for funding for AIDS research and for getting medicine into people's hands, and there's no longer this same level of stigma around AIDS and silence around AIDS. But in the 1980s and early 1990s, first of all, coming from the Reagan administration, there was a real silence. Surgeon General Koop was someone who had a lot to say about AIDS, and there were people in the administration who were like, you're not going to talk about this. And it's not until 1986 that he releases a report that talks about this crisis and this epidemic and the moral obligation, in addition to the scientific and medical obligation, that the United States government has to addressing this epidemic. And so ACT UP's approach is really important because it makes you pay attention to something that so many people weren't paying attention to. And
or
at a
didn't
time,
want to pay attention to.
Exactly. And that when they were paying attention to it, people like Pat Robertson, Pat Buchanan, Jesse Helms, William F. Buckley Jr., like there were all of these people who saw AIDS as righteous punishment for same-sex sex. And it becomes this thing where they're like, oh, we should tattoo people with AIDS so people know what's happening and so people know what their diagnosis is, and we should put them in camps. And, we shouldn't be putting money towards research to stopping this because this is God's righteous judgment. And that was the political atmosphere that people were agitating for AIDS funding and AIDS research in.
Yeah. And I want to point out one other thing in there, which is I think that a lot of people don't know the history of how much the AIDS crisis was diminished and marginalized. And a lot of people don't know that history, but like in 1982, there's audio of Reagan's press secretary laughing when asked about AIDS and making basically a gay joke. But I also think it's important to point out that that's 1982, 1983, 1984. We're in 1991 here, and the same stuff is happening. So we're talking about a decade of apathy and aggressive marginalization. So it's not just like, in the early days of the AIDS crisis, there was this, we're talking about a community watching people die for a decade at this point, and still seeing people like Jesse Helms refer to the quote-unquote homosexual lifestyle as the main thing here. He says there is not one single case of AIDS in this country that cannot be traced in origin to sodomy. But, again, I think it's important to highlight that this is almost a full decade into this fight, at this moment that we're talking about.
And we should also note that he refused to speak to the mother of Ryan White, who was a teenager who died of AIDS after receiving a transfusion with HIV blood. So not everybody that has AIDS or is HIV positive is a result of same-sex relations. And yet, the refusal to acknowledge that, to really look scientifically at the disease holistically, that denial is also something that should be a part of the narrative.
Yeah. And so just to ground another thing in the timeline, we're talking about September 5th, 1991. Magic Johnson announces that he has AIDS in November of 1991. That is obviously such a huge turning point in terms of making people realize. People should have realized a lot earlier, but making people realize this is not just a quote-unquote gay disease. But in this particular moment, in this particular part of activism, we're just a couple months shy of that.
And importantly, too, because that becomes a really important shift, particularly for getting conservatives on board for AIDS research and AIDS funding. Yeah. Because in 1992 at the Republican National Convention, Mary Fisher speaks about her HIV diagnosis, and she had gotten HIV from her husband. And this idea that sort of being held up as the blameless victim of AIDS is something that Ryan White was held up as well. It's a bow to the homophobia, right? It's not challenging the homophobia. It's saying, okay, well, maybe gay people deserve this, but it is also now affecting non-gay people. And so we should pay attention and we should feel empathy for this.
Right. Yeah, so I don't think I even realized it going into this episode, but maybe we're talking about here kind of one of the final moments where there's this big gulf between thinking of this as a homosexual disease, and really in the fall, winter, and into 1992 it starts to change ever so slightly. But in this moment, 1991, this condom over Jesse Helms's house. I mean, what else do we need to know about Helms himself and why he was a target in this sense?
So Jesse Helms is a senator from North Carolina, and he is a senator for about 30 years. But he becomes known as being the senator of no. I have rarely encountered someone who was so anti-everything. Anti-integration, anti-voting rights, anti-women's rights, anti-disability rights, anti-the National Endowments of the Arts. Like, who's against the arts? Like, he was against everything, especially gay rights. But it just, it's remarkable that not only him opposing these things was a part of his platform, but there's so much pride about his stance, about being sort of the person that will shut down, will prevent any legislation from promoting ideas that that really just aren't white supremacists. I mean, maybe that's just the best way to sort of surmise all of it, but that is sort of his stance. And I think it's important to understand that he's not just against gay rights. He's pretty much against everyone's rights. Yeah,
he was a much hated figure in North Carolina and nationally because he represented so many of these things Kellie is talking about, and was kind of an avatar for the culture wars before people started talking about them as culture wars, and was such a much clearer connection between the culture wars of the 1990s and the segregationist sentiments which Helms held dearly of the 1960s and 70s.
And, certainly I think the culture war element here is important, and this is a stunt that taps into a sort of cultural conversation. But also Helms is, a powerful elected official who has his hands on some funding levers. And I think that's a big part of the conversation here, is just trying to get, not just shift the cultural tide, but trying to get actual funding for AIDS research. Because, again, 10 years in, there wasn't the political will to really confront this epidemic. Okay.
We should talk about the stunt itself.
Please. Yes. Let's come back to it. Many amazing details.
Right. They go to his home in Arlington, Virginia, and you can probably already hear echoes of the conversations about protesting public figures at their homes, something that has come up a lot in the last 5 years. They go to his home. They make sure that he's not home, because they don't want to trap him in his house and get arrested and make it a much bigger story where they're the bad guys. So they make sure that he's away, and they just come in with their giant ladders and their giant condom, and nobody bothers them, right? They just they've sort of reconned the house. So the two members of the group had come by and they'd taken pictures, and they were like, okay, well, we can figure out the size of this because a standard door is 80 inches. And so therefore we can extrapolate the height of the house and how big of a condom we need. And they go to the giant inflatable condom company. 3,000.
They commissioned it from a novelty company in California, and as you're saying, they practiced.
I'd love
they,
to know.
They did a practice run on a house in New Paltz, New York, and then they knew. So yes, like any good activist, they had done the dry
There's
run.
practice.
They did the practice. Yes, it's very important to practice how to put on a condom, because when you're actually in the moment and you're trying to do it, you can fumble. It gets very stressful. There's other things on your mind. So yes.
So they got themselves a
Safe.
2-story banana and practiced on that in New Paltz.
It's just crazy to me that like neighbors are
Yes.
watching them do this.
Love it.
You know?
Well, it's like that thing about when you live in New York, it's just like you can never underestimate people's desire to just like keep it moving, mind your own business. Like, yeah, there's that thing going on there, but you know what? I'm just going to put my head down, and that's kind of what happened here. And moreover, I think, as you were saying, Nikki, because he wasn't home, the cops eventually show up, and basically the cops are pretty chill about it, and they basically say, all right, take it down and go on your way. And that's
show's
about it.
over.
But it gets some press attention. They did get a parking ticket because their U-Haul was parked illegally. It was parked in the wrong direction, so it wasn't punishment. It was a legit parking ticket. They parked incorrectly. That was maybe the one part of this that they didn't do the dry run on. And other than that, I think that's basically it. Now there are some rumors that actually David Geffen funded this stunt. It cost about $3,000. Some people who were involved say that David Geffen was part of this, and we should point out that this was also part of a kind of group within ACT UP called TAG, which is either Treatment Action Group or Treatment Activist Guerrillas, but was designated for these particular guerrilla type stunts.
I think it's so hilarious that one of the TAG members, James Serafini, basically says, quote, "We need protection against Helms' bigotry and ignorance. Condoms have worked pretty well in protecting against HIV. So we decided to try one on the senator."
There you go.
I'm like, love it. Love it.
It's pretty great.
Nikki, what is your sense of the sort of reaction in the moment? This did garner press coverage, but
It did. So they were actually really savvy about getting the press there. CNN was the only 24-hour news network at the time, so they called up CNN. They had called a number of local television stations, and they didn't tell them whose house they were going to, but they said they were going to pull this stunt. And so they had good news coverage. At the same time, there's still this reticence to accept this kind of activism. So there was this column in the Washington Post where they were writing about how this was childish and juvenile, and straight bashing is no better than gay bashing, which, big eye roll. Not sure that they were bashing Jesse Helms because he was straight.
Yeah, I know.
But those kind of, fatuous arguments that are really about discomfort with this kind of activism.
Yeah. The condom was later installed in Los Angeles at the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives. I'm curious if it's still there. I think how to dispose of a used condom, big dilemma.
Right.
I'm glad they didn't flush it down the toilet. That's irresponsible. But it sounds like maybe it's still, I don't know, maybe listeners, someone can let us know if that's still there at the archives or if it's still floating around. I mean, you don't. Yeah, what do you do with all that?
Because how do you hold? I mean, I don't know how you display it, but that would.
Well,
be
you have to build a replica of Jesse Helms'
Right.
house, and then you have to put it up.
It's the only way to do
I
it.
have no idea.
And then one other little cultural moment, I guess, that I gather the TV show Pose, which I haven't seen, but it's like on my list. Nikki or
so
Kelly, you've
good.
seen it?
I've watched all 3
So I
seasons.
think they
I'm
riff
kinda
on
sad
this.
There was only
They
3
do- or they
seasons.
do-
They do.
yeah.
They do. Yeah, it's. I mean, all of Pose really talks about the ACT UP movement in general. So I think it's, if you want to sort of relive some of the most controversial and exciting moments of this era, Pose is a really good show for that.
Always nice to end with a TV rec from Kelly. Yes. Okay. That brings us to the end of the show. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with transcripts. Julie Shapiro is executive producer for Radiotopia. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com where you can can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at ThisDayPod on Instagram and Twitter, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I'm here today because Jesse Helms is the devil. Jesse Helms has, I think, got to be one of the most evil men in America and has worked for years to do as much as he possibly can to ensure the continuance of the AIDS epidemic.
We're here to basically say, you mess with us and you're going to wake up one morning with a condom on your house.
Radiotopia.